Amen. Okay, the picture that you have up here, I was quite taken by it. And so, when you go into Google Images, you see something you like, you can click on it, you go to the website, there was no explanation, nothing. I'm thinking, well, what in the world is this thing supposed to mean? And finally, I decided that the wisdom of the people that published that picture said, come up with your own. And so what fascinates me is what strikes me about this image is the majestic nature of it is there, of course, but it displays the trips that Moses went up and down. Moses wasn't a young man, right? He's going up to speak to the Lord. He's going back to deliver them, up and down, up and down. And it speaks to mind the intercessory nature of Moses in this time of year, because here you had this holy God and you had this sinful people, and we had to have it. That was just a wonderful display of that. As we transition to our lesson, it may be good for us to go quickly back to the beginning. As we've been studying for the past several months, God created the world. You know that, you're here. When God created the world, he said, and it was good. But it wasn't long before things transpired that it became not so good. In fact, it got so bad during that time, as you know, God decided to destroy the world. He decided to start over, starting over with a man named Noah, excuse me. God needed a new plan. He needed a new process. I don't really know what the process was before, but he clearly had a different one once that started. And that reminded me of the promises that, starting with Noah, God made to the patriarchs. Cover those real quick. In Genesis chapter 12, he talks to Abraham. As you know, Abraham was his selected person to be the seed of Jerusalem. He says, I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you, and all the earth, peoples on earth will be blessed through you. Notice a nation, a great nation. In the 15th chapter, he tells Abraham, know for certain that for 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country, not their own, and that they will be enslaved and mistreated there. I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterward they will come out with great possessions. You're going to be a great nation. By the way, you're going to be slaves. Chapter 26, he talks to his son, talks to Isaac. Notice he's going down through the patriarchs. And he says, stay in this land for a while, and I will be with you and will bless you. For to you and your descendants I will give these lands and will confirm the oath that I swore to your father Abraham previous to time. Chapter 28, he has another conversation with Jacob. This is when Jacob was at Bethel, when he saw the stairway to heaven. And there above it stood the Lord, and he said, I will give you and your descendants the land on which you are lying. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you and your offspring. So the message, starting with Abraham, is consistent down through Abraham's descendants. And of course, those descendants are what we refer to as the patriarchs. So now they go into 400 years. And now God's talking to Moses. Moses is his man. You may remember this is where Moses encountered God on Mount Sinai at the burning bush. He was trembling. And God is saying, hey, I need you to do something for me. He says, oh, no, no, no. I'm not the right person to do this. I can't speak. I can't do this. I'm humble. I'm a shepherd. God never even acknowledges that. He just says, I will be with you. And this is your sign that I will be with you, that when you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God at this very mount. So you can see the progression of time, the progression of promises, the progression, here we are. So lo and behold, here we are today at the mountain. A few things struck me about this. As you all know, I'm in the business world. And so I tend to look at things through the business end. And there's a term that we use in the business world called at scale. Okay? Well, what do we mean by at scale? Well, generally what happens is when you start something, you lose money until you get up to a point where you're at scale. And all of a sudden, now you're in a position to be reaping the rewards of the benefits that you started. So if God was going to make these people into a nation, he kind of needed some scale, didn't he? So he had 400 years in Egypt for them to multiply upon themselves and become a large people. So this may or may not be true, but in my mind, it's like, okay, now we're getting them to a point in time where they are now in a spot where we can make them into that nation status. And so after 400 years of this, of being in slavery, and this came out last week in Oleg's lesson, is that they essentially worked, ate, and slept. That's what they did for 400 years. They didn't have a lot of choices to make. It was just their order. So they were really a people that weren't capable of a whole lot of things. They certainly were not ready to become a nation at this point in time. So the first 18 chapters of Exodus, we are now starting on 19 today, can be described in two words: deliverance, dependency. Deliverance, clearly, we know the story. You had the amazing miracles. You had God acting on his promises. But then where did he take them? He didn't take them to the promised land. He took them where? To the desert. Now, why in the world would he take them to the desert? Dependency. Remember Oleg's thread last week? He had 4 lines across the screen. They were healing, hunger, thirst, and protection. These are basic needs. When you're out in the desert, you got nothing around you. You're wholly dependent upon God to give you your daily sustenance. So there's a lesson in here, okay, in what he's doing. So now that takes us to chapter 19, and now we enter into the third D word, and that is development. Development. So development into what? Well, he's got to develop them into a nation. Remember the covenant with Abraham? He says, I'm going to make you a great nation. He now has the size and scale. People know that he can deliver. He's demonstrated that. And so now it's time for them to become his covenant people. So in essence, he is setting them up to receive his instructions on how they're going to go do it. So there we are. So as I prepared for this lesson today, memories just come out from all over the place. I was reminded of my 8th grade civics class that took place about 50 years ago. It's amazing we can't remember somebody's name, but we can remember 50 years ago under the right stimulation. And I had a civics teacher named Mr. Oswald. Mr. Oswald was set up on his lectern. He had a beard and he would do this. And he would say, today, we are going to cuss and discuss the merits of the Bill of Rights. And I have never forgotten that. And there are many times that I have repeated that. Unfortunately, the cussing does come out. I try to do it, oops, didn't mean to do that, but you get the point. Basically says, we're going to look at the pros and cons of this. And so as I thought about that, I thought, is there a parallel or some similarities between how Israel started a nation to our country, the United States? And so, as we know, when the Americans won their independence back in the late 1700s, they were getting away from England. They said, okay, we would now won our independence. Now what do we do? Well, we probably need to have something to steer us in the right direction. So they came up with the United States Constitution. The preamble is on the screen. I'm not going to read every word, but just take a look at the blue words. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, justice, tranquility, defense, welfare, liberty, do ordain and establish this Constitution. Okay, so what do they do? Well, in that Constitution, the first thing they did is says, here's the articles of the Constitution. And those articles went through and they established the government, the legislative, the executive, the judicial branch. It established the roles of the states and the federal. Most importantly, it established that the United States Constitution was the supreme law of the land, and the judicial system that he set up must adhere to that. Okay, well, 4 years later, we come along with the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights, you may remember, were 10 amendments, the first amendments. And really what they did is they weren't anything new. They just provided explanation of what had come before in the articles. Things like the right to bear arms, the right to free speech, the right to freedom of religion, the right of the free press, which you have to question at times, however, the right of peaceable assembly. Okay? And then finally, the one you probably know the most about is the Fifth Amendment. The right not to incriminate yourself. Remember the O.J. Simpson trial when they put Mark Furman on the stand and he says, I invoke my right to the Fifth Amendment. They kept asking questions, Fifth Amendment. Okay. Well, those were not new, but those were expansions of what had come before it. And so then in the next 200 and some years, from 1795, they only passed another, 17 amendments. So what is particularly impressive to me about this is that they really got it right. You can debate that, but there has been very little change to the Constitution over the past 240 years, which is really somewhat remarkable. Now, there's obviously lots of laws change, but the fundamental precepts of what that is the Constitution. So let's compare that to what we're seeing today and how God is moving with Israel. So at the beginning of chapter 19, it says, on the first day of the third month after the Israelites left Egypt. So that's about 60 days after they left Egypt. So that's why I told you earlier, in the first 60 days, you had this amazing amount of stuff that happened. It says that on that very day, they came to the desert of Sinai, and Israel camped there in the desert in front of the mountain. And then at that point, Moses begins his descent up and down the mountain. So he went up to God, and God called him and said, this is what you are to say to these people. You yourselves see what I did to Egypt and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all the nations, you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you must speak to the Israelites. So Moses went, and we'll do more of that in a second. Now, I'm going to quickly cover our entire, we have what, 13 chapters today? A lot of stuff in there. This is really the summary of it. He gives them the 10 commandments in chapter 20. In chapter 20, think of those as the articles. Chapters 21 through 23, he gives them lots of detail. In other words, it's almost like God is saying, I'm going to give you these high-level commandments, but I know you're going to have questions, you're going to have quarrels and disputes among you, so I'm going to go ahead and give you guidelines on how to do that. So God's thinking ahead, and he knows that. So call that the exposition. And then finally, we begin talking about the building of the tabernacle. So going back to that same concept where God is, it's kind of like, okay, I'm thinking ahead and I know that you're going to make mistakes. You're going to need some explanation. You're also going to need a process by which to survive in this. Now I'm going to go back to the eagle's wings. It's hard to talk about eagles without having a visual aid because they are such a magnificent animal. Also think about what I'm going to show you here. And the three words we talked about are delivery, dependence, development. Okay. You see the mother eagle has just provided the delivery of her baby. Notice that she's providing the baby with food. That baby is wholly dependent on the mother. On the right-hand side, you can see that there's a rainstorm. What's the mother eagle doing? She is providing protection for her young. And then finally, Laura, when we see development. Now, unfortunately, that's not an eagle, that's a crow. That's the best I could do. And what's fascinating, you start doing all this research and you hear stories about it swoops down and it catches it. Well, there's no video of it. I couldn't find them anywhere. So I'm not 100% sure if that's truth or fiction. However, you get the point. The point is there is this magnificent display. Now, this concept is not unique to the eagle, but it is the illustration that God put in there. It says, I am here offering you what the mother does this. So now that takes us back to the covenant at Sinai, and I've kind of already touched on these points a bit. But I'm going to go down and focus now on covenant. What we just talked about is that here we have the dependency aspects, and now we talk about this covenant. Okay, well, this covenant is, what is that? Well, At a big picture level, that is what we're calling the development. That is the beginnings of them developing the holy nation. And if they keep that covenant, he says, you will be my treasured possession. And the treasured possession is, obviously, pardon me, I got my notes. You are going to be a special mission, a special process to the rest of the world. I love all the world, God says, but you are going to be my ambassador. And in short, you are going to be representing my character to the world. So all through there, he is setting them up to launch into this process of being his chosen people. And finally, as we mentioned in the tabernacle, he's looking ahead. We'll cover much more of the tabernacle later, but this tabernacle is going to be his mechanism to demonstrate how he can dwell among them and help them. So that is the high level summary of our lesson today. Now we're gonna, in a few minutes, we're gonna drop down to a lower altitude and talk about a few things, but anybody have any comments? Anybody have any questions along these lines that you would like to bring up before we get started?
In your study, you come across why God was so detailed in everything? Was it that he was particular about, just say, the temple itself, but everything? He talked about who should be stoned to death and what the punishments were for this crime or that crime. Or is it that the children of Israel were so accustomed to be under the control of a governing body in Egypt as slaves? Why so much detail?
Great question. I suspect all of us have had that. There's probably a multitude of answers. I guess I flip back to last week. Oleg did a masterful job of leading the class to having a mindset towards what the people were like when they came out. And I think you hit on it now, Elmer, is that they had been under rule. They were slaves.
Generation.
They had to be told everything to do. And so their ability to think for themselves was probably compromised. And so, like I said earlier, God says, and if I just give you these 10 commandments and just walk away, they're not going to know what to do. And so they're going to have questions. And we also remember the devil's in the mix, right? The devil's in the mix. He's throwing roadblocks away. And so my assumption is he's given those detailed instructions to be able to deal with things that come along. That's my opinion, but hear others, please.
I think it's a good question. Well, first, I wonder if, coming out of 400 years of slavery, they really didn't think much for themselves. They were told how to do this and how to do that. So it was not a mindset to be very detailed oriented in their own creative mind. This is what we're going to do. They're told what to do. So it's changing the dynamics for the thing. Secondly, while the details about how to worship, the penalties, in fact, I was reading penalties this week. There are a lot of them. You know, they were coming to Moses with all of their gripes, and they're lined up on a line that was a whole day long. It says, finally, Jethro, his father-in-law, comes and says, listen, you appoint judges for you. Now, if everything, I'm sure in Egypt it's well scripted out what happens if you do. So I think it might have been to help Moses and the judges say, well, listen, you should know this already, here it is. You can judge for yourself, so don't waste my time.
Excellent. Great point. Yeah, I mean, really that process of development really started in 18 with Jethro. Jethro says, hey, you need to get some structure and order. Yes, Barbara.
So when I read this, I'm always struck with how when Jesus came, he criticized them for focusing on minutia. And this seems like a lot of, I don't want to call it minutia because it's God's, but it's a lot of detail, And then down the road, Jesus turned around and criticized them for that. And I think he wanted them at that point, you've been my people long enough, maybe you should think for yourself a little, big picture principles as opposed to me having to spell. And plus, I think the Pharisees, they say, added their own codes to come up with Loretta knows all the 613 or whatever it is, the laws, but it just intrigues me, the juxtaposition, because, you know, I think a lot of us believe Jesus gave the commandments and gave all this, and then he comes around without, what, 1,500, 2,000 year, whatever it was, later, and criticizes them for not being able to look beyond that. So that's just kind of something I get stuck on.
Everybody resonate with that? Maureen?
Remember that there's a mixed multitude. So with the mixed multitude influencing decisions, thoughts, here you have with God giving you direct. So we're there today. We have what God has given us, and we have a lot of other stuff. So we get to choose. We know what's been given, and you know, how do you have the Spirit influence you to know which direction to go?
Right, very good. You have a comment, Paula?
So I think because they were slaves for so long, basic hygiene, everything was seen from a Christian lens. And so the rules that he gave them was how to be a cleaner, healthier people, if you will, because they had no direction. Like you say, you learn stuff from your parents, your grandparents over time. We have YouTube now. They didn't have any of that, right? The difference I find with the Pharisees was the Pharisees were using that as a tool to control how they could be religious. That's a very different reason, in my opinion. And so I don't have a problem with those two. I think they're very different focuses. I don't think we're supposed to follow the rules in Leviticus that God gave the Israelites. It was a different time. It was a different people, different focus. It was to help them become his children and to get away from the Egyptian way of doing things.
I'm gonna come to Walter and then to Lauren, but I'm gonna quote our founder, Ted Hamilton. I don't remember the exact situation. But to your point, Barbara, today, Jesus, remember what happened in the middle of that. I remember Ted was saying, in Jesus' time, they weren't going to let that happen again. They weren't going to allow their wickedness to put them back into that yo-yo effect or that circle effect, having that they went through in the Old Testament. And so they overreacted, became what they did. Walter.
I guess I have a different view of the slavery thing because I am not sure that the Israelites that came out of Egypt were any different than I am. I think that Paul says that I am coming out of slavery when I see Jesus and when he lives in me. And I am coming out in the same way that the Israelites are. And we are acting as if we arrived 200 years ago. So, you know, it's something to think about because there is still a plan that I would be free. And it's God's plan, and it's awesome through the blood of Jesus.
Tabernacle, Lauren, then Terry.
Like Barbara, I believe that the God that spoke from Sinai and gave the tablets of stone to Moses was God the Son, Jesus. And if so, then he, as you pointed out, he gave them these detailed rules for the reasons that the class has discussed. But when that same member of the Godhead, God the Son, came 2,500 years later, whatever it was, he showed them what God was like in the flesh. And when the rich young ruler approached him and said, "What must I do to be saved?" And he said, "Well, what does the scripture say?" And he said, he rattled off the 10 commandments, whatever. And Jesus said to him, "You have spoken well. I say to you, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. Neighbor as yourself." Basically said, those are the two principles. And the ceremonial washings outside the tabernacle and the rituals cleansings and all of that stuff. It's love the God and love your neighbor as yourself. Made it simple.
wondering if it'd help if we compare it to music. A composer doesn't just compose notes to be played in a didactic way. He's trying to reproduce a soul, something deeper, emotional. And I think we've all heard pianists and organists who play the notes perfectly, perfectly. But then we hear someone who feels the soul of that music. It's a whole nother arena. Fortunately, by the way, Will Bennett feels the soul. Like you had organists here in the past that only play the notes. So compare that with Jesus. He came, they're keeping all the rules. He said, "You're loyal, but I need a partner who's loyal and emotional, loving." He says, "You're missing the author of these rules is supposed to lead you to expressing the soul of the rule maker, and you got there."
Beautiful. The punchline of today may have just been spoken, so ignore what he said.
I'm used to that.
Come back next week if you want to hear. Okay, so folks, you cannot understate the importance of this event. This was huge. 60 days through all they went through. Today's the day. Today's the day. This is a big, big, big deal. Arthur.
During Israel's enslavement, were they allowed to practice their religion?
Don't know? Anybody know?
Because in my mind, I'm saying a lot of what they're now told to do may not have been entirely new to them.
They work 7 days.
They knew that killing was wrong. They knew that stealing was wrong, I would assume. I think that in my mind, I'm saying, well, they knew a lot of this. This may have been really.
This Israelite, they were segregated in own community, not mixed with Egyptian, because they grew so many people, thousands of them. They married between themselves and grow that way, or I'm just thinking of mine. In this country, the segregated Japanese or Chinese and different people, and the Indians are separated and so forth. And in Nicaragua, where I come from, when the Sandinista come, it separated my people with this tribe, separated. So where these people segregated themselves, or what happened?
In Egypt? Well, I believe, I'm not the expert, but I believe they live in a certain area of it that, I don't know if we want to call it self-contained, etc. So I don't know. I'm not the expert on that. Does anybody have any knowledge of what Santiago was talking? But hold on to that thought, and maybe we will somewhere get our way to it. All right, so we are at the mountain. Okay, we've heard the preamble. We know what's going to follow. So let's go back to the event itself. Elmer, since you're such a wonderful reader, will you read 7 and 8, please?
So Moses went back and summoned the elders of the people and set before them all the words the Lord had commanded him to speak. The people all responded together, "We will do everything the Lord has said." So Moses brought the answer back to the Lord.
Okay. He went back and he went and told them, and they said, "We will do it." Now, I'm gonna be a smart aleck for a minute. Apologies for this. What options did they have? I'm not trying to be flippant. It's just that they responded in a way, but when you don't have any options, you have to doubt the sincerity of it. Did they really know what they were saying? And so they just responded. But clearly what's happening is there's a process by which God is moving this along, and so stay tuned. So Elmer, go ahead and read 9, please.
The Lord said to Moses, "I'm going to come to you in a dense cloud so the people will hear me speaking with you and will always put their trust in you." Then Moses told the Lord what the people had said.
Love what God's doing here. What he doing is he is setting Moses up to be successful. He is making it very clear when he goes through this process coming forward that Moses is going to be their intercessor, their spokesperson between them and God. And so now what we're doing is he's now getting them prepared for the events that are to follow. So in in verses 10 through 19, he says, look, you need to get ready. Prepare yourself, wash your clothes, don't have sex, okay? Do not approach the mountain. Do not approach the mountain. He comes back later and says, do not approach the mountain. He's telling them over and over again. Why not approach the mountain? Because remember what happened when Moses was at the burning bush? God said, don't come any closer. It's holy ground. You're going to get killed. The entire mountain was holy now because God was there. So he says, on the third day, there's going to be a thick cloud and the Lord is going to descend on it with fire, which he did. And when he did that, I'm sorry, I apologize. He says, do not approach the mountain until after the ram's horn, because he's looking forward to the next event. So on the third day of that process, a thick cloud descended over the mountain. The Lord descended on it with fire. And you can imagine the reaction of the people. They were scared to death. Moses spoke, God answered. Now, I don't think God verbalized anything at that point, but I think the point is that he was going through a process to get them ready and to clearly establish that he was communicating with Moses. I want to do a quick commercial break here and talk to you about something that Luann sent out in the chat. Anybody in here not heard of Ron Wyatt? Everybody's heard of Ron Wyatt? Wow, this is great. You haven't heard of Ron? Why didn't you raise your hand, Barbara? I had not heard of Ron Wyatt until 2015 when a number of us were in Israel. And our wonderful guide there who was telling us about Ron Wyatt. And it was in the context of underneath the cave, underneath Calvary and those sorts of things. But Ron Wyatt was a nurse anesthetist out of Madison, Tennessee. He was an amateur archaeologist. I'm sure there's people out there that think he's crazy. I'm not one of those. But if there's a whole website, YouTube videos out there. But Ron Wyatt did some research. He came to his conclusion is that this is where the Red Sea crossing was. When you look on the left-hand side, there was a big enough area to accommodate the people. When you looked on the right-hand side, there was a big enough area to accommodate the people. And oh, by the way, when you dove down into the water, he found stuff underneath, chariot wheels, those sorts of things.
No.
Also, this section of the sea was not as deep as the rest. So it's just fascinating the facts he came through. So then he says, we need to go find the Mount Sinai. Well, the traditional site of Sinai is thought of to be in this area. This is called the Sinai Peninsula, but Ron Wyatt says, wait a minute, it says after they crossed over the Red Sea, then they went to Mount Sinai. And so this is back in either the 80s or the 90s, but you couldn't get in there. So the YouTube video talks about all the process that they went to, but eventually they went over there and did their research, and they came across this mountain right here. And the proper name of that is called Jebel al-Lawz or something. But what do you notice about the mountain?
Aaron.
The top of the mountain
Black.
is black. What just happened? The Lord descended on the mountain with fire. And as they climbed the mountain, and they got up to this point, they chipped away the tops of the rock. Underneath, the rock was the same color as this down here, indicating that some external influence came and created that. Big coincidence, pretty compelling. Okay, then they go down, they go around, lo and behold, there are spots here that clearly lend itself to projecting and talking to a big audience. They found remnants of altars, they found remnants of pillars, et cetera, et cetera. Why am I telling you this? Because when you're studying this thing, this type of stuff just makes the Bible come alive. Going to Israel, unbelievable experience. And this kind of brought that same feeling back to me. So again, when you go to the website, they're not very good. They're not highly qualified. These are just normal people. But if you would like to have something to enrich your experience, go on to the Ron Wyatt website. So, all right, commercial's over. Now we're back to So we just gone through 10 through 19. We are now in 2025. Okay, it says the Lord descended on the mountain. He called Moses up again. He repeated the warnings about the people coming to the mountain. And then he put boundaries around the mountain and set it apart as holy. I want to talk about boundaries. 2 or 3 big things popped into my head this week. Lots more, but that's all my simple mind can handle. Boundaries. When you use the word boundaries, what's your instantaneous reaction to boundaries?
What's on the other side?
Tell me who, I can't hear who's talking.
What's on the other side?
What's on the other side? Okay, a curiosity? Is that another way of saying, Elmer, I'm sorry?
You can't go down.
Cannot pass this point. Okay,
Stay out of my space.
stay out of my space. Okay,
You're being restricted.
who, what?
You're being restricted.
You're being restricted.
Limitations,
What
limitation.
limitation? Okay. All right, you guys are doing great. Those were, if I were to diagnose each of those, in my non-scientific mind, I would say those were negative connotations. Here's a boundary. This boundary is restricting my freedom. I want to know what's the other side. Last time I was up here, I talked about biases. How we had certain biases. From a different perspective. Is the boundary ultimately an expression of freedom?
Protection. Some type of protection, maybe.
I have a question. What you said, we didn't hear you.
Is the boundary in some form or fashion an expression of freedom? I'm gonna have to tell you a story on where I'm going here. You're getting tired of me talking to you about my dogs. 5 months ago, I was up here, I'll tell you, my dogs had a fight, I got involved, blah, 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 blah. Okay. After all that happened, we had a decision to make. We could continue living with the uncertainty that it would happen again. We could either give our older dog away. Well, I had to disclose the dog had bit me, so that's probably not gonna happen. I could put the dog down. Didn't want to do that, or we could invest in training. I was the naysayer about training. I'm thinking, look, all I want is the dogs not to fight. That's all I want. I just want them not to fight. But why do I need to teach them how to sit, heel, all these sorts of things? Why do I do that? Well, as I started listening, my bias changed, because what they're saying is, you are everything to that dog. You're everything to that dog. That dog is looking to you to provide structure to their lives, because when you provide structure to their lives, they know how to operate within the structure, and that makes them a much happier dog. The tension goes down, the anxiety goes down, and more than likely what's going to happen is these flare-ups of activities are more likely to happen. Oh, well, that's interesting. So your mind is probably going, that dog is completely focused on me, and it's looking on me to say, where are your boundaries? And inside those boundaries, that dog is happy. Getting the metaphor here? Reverse the situation. You're the dog. You got God. You're focused on God. God, can you just tell me what to do, God? Because if I know what to do, I can operate within those boundaries. And fascinating what dog training can teach a person. It's it really is very, very simple, but very, very, very logical.
Did it work?
TBD. It's like taking aspirin, Lauren. It won't guarantee you not having a heart attack, but it reduces your chance. There you go. There you go. Okay. All right. So that takes us to chapter 20. We're back to a preamble. God is speaking audibly to the people, and God spoke all these words. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. Why is he focusing on I am the Lord of God? Well, one thought is, how many gods did they have in Egypt? Lots of them. You could touch him, you could feel him, this, that, and the other. God is making it very clear, you can't touch me, you can't feel me, you can't even come near the mountain that I'm standing on. You need to understand that I am God. Remember, we're in the process of dependency. We're in the process of development. He wants them to be a treasured possession. He wants them to be the light of the world. He wants to reflect the character. Well, if you're going to do that, then you need to be focused on me. On me. And then he goes through and he gives us the first 4 commandments. Now I'm gonna give you my punchline here and say, if you're focused on these first 4, you don't need to even know what the other 6 are. Here we go. Number 1. We often refer to these first 4 as vertical, and the second 6 is horizontal. Okay? The vertical is supreme devotion to God. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, Lord. You just told us that. Well, think about number 1. It says, you shall have no other gods before me. In the legal terms, we write contracts. Okay. In the legal terms, he said, I have an exclusivity clause with you. You and I are going to do business together, Jack, and we're not going to do business with anybody else. Exclusivity. Well, if you don't get that one right, you're not going to have much opportunity to do the rest of it. So the exclusivity clause, and he goes on to say, look, don't make any graven images. Why is he telling them that? Because that's what they just came from. Okay. Do not take my Lord in vain, my name in vain. And then, of course, he then moves on to the Sabbath, which is foundational to why we're here. So what really, really hit me this week was this fact right here. Is what is the purpose of the law in the context of the development of this nation? God is trying to form them to say, you need to be focused on me. You focused on me. And by the way, when you're focused on me, this is what will happen. Because I'm a God of love, I'm a God of honor, you will automatically honor your father. You're not going to murder, you're not going to steal, you're not going to lie, you're not going to covet. All of a sudden, things like money, sex, and power are going to be not something that you achieve because you'll look at it in the context of your relationship with me. And so Tim Keller is who I listen to a lot, but he said, this is the law is relational. Now, what happened, Barbara, is they forgot the relationship aspect of it is, and they started looking at the physical over and over and over again. And that's what happened when they got Jesus. But if we, looking back on this now and say, wow, if I just really am like my dog, focused on me, and then I truly understand what God is, then all of a sudden I don't need to think that I'm not going to steal Santiago's car. It's not even going to be, I'm just going to see Santiago and I'm like, man, great to see you. I'm not thinking about what I could do to him because connected to. So thoughts. Tim Keller said he used the term, this is radical. It's been there. I've been reading it for 60 some years. I've never thought about it like that because I'm only thinking about tangible things. Here's my checklist. I get up today. Don't do these things. All that every day, make sure I don't do that. Why would I want to do that? Come on, Walter.
I think that this is so different than any of the religions that were part of the ancient world. This is totally radical. It's one of the reasons why Israel, even today, had enmity with everyone, and why Christians, in essence, at least in our own culture, are becoming an enmity because people are no longer there. They are way out in another field. So this is radical.
Yes.
Yes, I've heard, and you probably have too, that This is talking about a miracle that occurs in us, that it was a miracle that he brought them out of the land of slavery. And so he's saying, you will not worship other gods before me because you're changed inside. You will naturally honor your father and mother. These are all promises. So that's how I see it, as boundaries, but also promises.
So 5 through 10 are done as a result of your relationship with God. Yes, sir.
Why does Paul then refer to the law as a kind of a can't follow the law? One of the purposes of the law is to show you that you can't follow it.
So
And then it forces you to point in a direction as far as, well, then what is the answer?
Let's try this. That's why all of our chapters today is a big chunk. I've just laid out for you what I've learned this week. That the law is not enough. I've just showed you that the law is relational. I really am, if I have that relationship with God, I won't do these things, but guess what? We're still gonna do those things because we're sinful people. And so now what does God do? He gives us the tabernacle. And now you're gonna say, well, you know, all the details and all this, that, and the other, I can't explain all that. I can't explain why he's given the details. But what did the tabernacle point to? It points to Jesus. Right? So the beauty of this is the blessings is that you have this situation where God has provided you with grace. And out of that grace, we are geared towards obedience out of love, not out of getting something. But then when we fall, he gives us this opportunity with the tabernacle to come back and have an atonement done for us. I don't know if I directly answered your question, but I think it's part of that process, Terry.
I'm wondering if also the law is pointing out sin, so don't do the law. That's what we're referring to. Again, going through this letter of the law, the spirit of the law, it's the soul of it. Maybe he's first of all, by violating the letter of the law, you're showing that you haven't been interested in the soul of the law. It's this relationship. And then he says you can't do it. Well, we can't. Then Paul comes along and says, you have to become a new creature in Jesus Christ. Then you become one. Maybe it's a deeper, more relational thing that's going on there.
So because of Christ, we can come boldly before the throne of grace to see mercy, find grace in all kind of need because of Jesus. Because we're going to keep making mistakes.
We are. Thankfully, we have that opportunity.
Provided a solution for us.
He sure did. Yes, sir.
Just a thought to expand on what he said. The only thing that makes a difference in me is the reality that God is dwelling in me. We put the emphasis on on man doing the things that God says, and that is great. But unless he is actually living in me, I am absolutely nothing, regardless of all the good that I do. And, you know, so the tabernacle thing, if we want to turn it around, for me, this tabernacle would be the safety of Jesus. What he says is, for you, I am your safety by being in you and remaining in you and making you home.
Amen. So we've hit all around this today. We've stated it. But for those of us who've been this so long, number one, I told you a long time ago, I had an attitude I didn't really want to get into the Old Testament and didn't like it. Tom, you asked me the question earlier, can you point out the difference between the God of the New Testament and the God of the Old Testament? Well, for me, This is a demonstration of the gospel. Think about it. I was going to write this on the board, but we don't have time. What is the gospel? Grace, obedience, not obedience out of what I get, but because of grace, I obey. And then the benefits, right? Grace, obedience, benefits. The world is viewed obedience, grace, benefits. If you go to chapter 19, verse 4, I carried you out on eagle's wings. That's grace. He now comes along and demonstrates his love for them, and then he asks them to respond because of what he's already given them. And then when they do that, they will receive the blessings of being the treasured possession. This is the gospel. This is the gospel. We just haven't allowed, I have never allowed myself to see it until I studied it this way this week. It's absolutely beautiful. Another thing that Keller said this week, he said, if your mindset was about, I'm going to obey, and then I'm going to get the benefits, that is completely 100% self-centered. I am doing this because I get things. And he goes and said, but if you're living under grace, if you experience grace, then you're wanting, you're dying to obey because what you've already done. He goes, you're not obeying to get things, you're obeying to get God because you've already got God. And it's just an exemplification of that. And that's really what commandments 5 through 10 are.
I had seen something this past week talking about exchanging a couple of words when you're dealing with things. And the word is have and get. And it has to do with your attitude. I was brought up that I have to do this. I have to do it this way. And maybe we need to look at it instead of I have to do this. I get to do this. I get to follow, I get to honor, I get to do those things. So part of it, I believe, is an attitude adjustment with your relationship that you have with God. And change the word I have to. I get to.
Beautiful. Okay, well, it's 11:08. We got 2 minutes. Anything else? We've said it hundreds of times. This Christianity thing is all about relationship. All the time. I've said it, you've said it, we've all said it. And the relationship is manifested within the first 4 commandments. Homer, did you have your hand up?
Well, to me, this is a way for the children of Israel to know their boundaries, as you pointed out, and to have a way when they've crossed the boundaries, to ask for forgiveness, the whole sacrificial idea. It was also a way for God to be and dwell with them, the most holy place. Now, what happened at Calvary is we developed a direct communication with God where we didn't need the animals because Jesus became the person who spilled the blood. So I see this as the kind of the beginnings of the following of God, but ultimately we benefit from the idea that our communication with God can be very personal and continuous. They needed the tabernacle to get close to God. And so I see this as a part of the development of his people. It's like a child. You have to teach them what it means to not touch a hot stove. And so you set up rules, but later you expect that they will learn those rules on their own. So that's why I look at this that way.
Okay, very good. Tom, do you have a comment?
You know, growing up in the environment I was in as a young person in the church at that time, my picture of God was that he would do everything possible to keep me out of heaven. if I died with one sin unrepented, I was doomed. And I was clear, I was never going to be good enough to make it. Thankfully, later in life, the picture of God is he'll do everything possible to get me there. He desperately wants to spend time with me and hopes that I want to spend time with him as well. That's the good news of the gospel for me.
It is, and it's manifested very clearly right here. Yes, ma'am.
David said we were born in sin and shaped in iniquity. And we cannot by ourselves do anything good. By nature, we're also shaped by our environment. So by nature and nurture, we're not good. So it is radical. Transformation is radical. It's only through the grace of God that we can be changed and become like him.
Amen. I think that's a second to last thing in the day. Okay, yes, Carly.
Look at it. In different ways, restrictive. Or else if you, or keeps you safe, if you snow ski, you're very happy to ski in an area where there are boundaries. You know that if you are skiing within the boundaries, especially in the United States, you know that there's nice boundaries. You ski in Europe, the boundaries are not as marked and it's a little bit icier, but we know that if you stay in the boundaries, at least it's a little bit more safety and it keeps you safer. And I think that's one of the things that the Ten Commandments, it keeps you safer, it helps you live a better life.
So in Miley, what I'm hearing, Carlene, is you have a much greater sense of freedom and enjoyment skiing in the United States than you do in Europe. That's exactly what you said, because you knew what you had to operate in.
On, it's not they don't roll it off.
In Europe, so yeah, you just like, you don't know what to do, so your tension. So did somebody else, do you have a comment?
I have found a parallelism with the Israel experience, with the commission that Jesus gave us. For example, go to, in Matthew 28, right? Go to all nations, go to Egypt in the past, right? And baptize them in the name of the Holy Spirit, pass through the river or the sea, right? Teaching them all the things that I have commanded. Great commandment, right? And the sanctuary is the relationship, right? I will be with you until the end of the journey, right? Perfect. That's
Beautiful.
yeah, it's part of our mission now.
Indeed it is. Well, as always, we know God's awesome. We know he's omniscient. We know he's omnipresent. And he just does everything. But thankfully, there's 4 things that he doesn't know when it comes to me and you. Right? Can we say that all together? Let's go. God does not know a sin he does not hate. God does not know a sinner he does not love. God does not know a sin he won't forgive. God does not know over time and now. Amen. Blessing is on you. Come back next week, because guess what? There's a whole lot of sin going on in chapter 32, and Mr. Cooler will lead us through it. So have a good day.
Makes life no different.